They burned his home and took his wife. Until he came back leading 500 men. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Please drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The fire did not start loud. It started with a whisper of heat crawling along dry boards and the soft crack of sap waking inside Old Pine. The ranch sat a mile outside town, where the land sloped toward the creek and the cottonwoods leaned like tired men. At dawn, he had fixed a hinge and fed the horse and kissed his wife on the cheek. She smelled of soap and sage and bread. Rising slow by nightfall, smoke pressed the stars out of the sky. Men came with torches and jokes and a kind of courage that only grows in groups. They called him names they had practiced for years. They said the land was wrong, the marriage was wrong, the silence was wrong. He stood in the yard with empty hands while flames climbed the porch posts like they had been waiting for permission. His wife stepped out once holding a small bundle of beads tied on a leather cord, the one her mother had given her. She did not cry. She looked at him as if to memorize his face. The men pulled her away and the cord snapped and the beads scattered into the dirt like small moons. A laugh cut through the fire. Someone kicked him down. He tasted dust and iron and smoke. The horse screamed once from the corral, then went quiet. The house folded in on itself, and the sound was not loud either. It sounded tired, like a long breath ending. When the men left, they left nothing that could argue back. He lay there until the heat faded and the night cooled and the creek found its voice again. He did not chase, he did not shout. He gathered the beads one by one, even the blackened ones that burned his fingers. He sat where the door had been and watched the embers blink and die. The town would say it was a lesson. The town would say it was over. He would say nothing. The wind carried ash across the field and settled it on his shoulders like a gray coat. Somewhere down the road his wife was being taken past fences and mile markers and lies. He stood when the sun rose, because standing felt like a promise. He placed the beads in his pocket and looked once more at the ground where his life had stood. Then he turned toward the open land and began to walk out. Here justice does not hurry, it waits and remembers. By morning the field was gray and quiet, and the creek ran low and clear as if it had not witnessed anything worth remembering. He walked until his boots found the road, and then he followed it south past fence lines he had mended for neighbors who would not meet his eyes, past a schoolhouse where the bell waited for hands that would ring it again. He was a rancher by habit, not by title, a man who measured days by water and wind and the weight of feed sacks. He had come west with nothing and learned to keep it that way. He spoke little and listened long, and that was why the land had accepted him. His wife had found him that way, standing in the shade of cottonwoods, trading quiet for quiet. She was not fragile, though the town liked to say so. She worked the soil and knew the sky and laughed once at night when the coyotes started their song. She wore her hair tied back and kept a small leather cord at her throat because it reminded her who she was before the town learned her name. They married without a crowd and without permission and learned to live between glances. The town tolerated him until tolerance ran out. The road bent toward the low hills where scrub oak gave way to stone, and he remembered hauling water there in August when the well ran thin. He remembered a merchant who took his beef and paid late, and a preacher who would not shake his hand. He remembered kindness to a child who left apples at his gate and ran off laughing, and an old man who shared a blade and said nothing. He carried these memories like tools, choosing which to use and which to leave behind. He did not look for trouble, and trouble had found him anyway. When hunger came, he ate what he could trade for and slept where the ground was level. He washed in the creek and kept moving. He avoided the town that night and the next because grief does not like company, and neither did he. At a crossing, he met a wagon driver who had heard Smoke's stories travel faster than men. The driver said the men were bragging already, and the law was tired and the road was open. He nodded and went on. He counted steps because counting steadied him, and he pressed the beads in his pocket to remind himself the world still had shape. He knew where they would take her. There were places on the map where names changed, but intent did not. He had once delivered hay near a canyon where riders gathered and deals were made. Without paper, he turned his face that way and felt the old ache in his ribs. Where a boot had found him, he did not curse the men because curses spend energy and he would need every bit of it. He thought of the land and the way it keeps score slowly. He thought of the vows spoken low and meant high. He crossed into the hills and followed a trail that cut toward water where the ground held tracks longer. He watched and waited and learned again how to be unseen. The wind carried voices, and he learned which ones mattered. By dusk, he reached a stand of juniper and stopped to rest. He set the beads on a flat stone and lined them as they had fallen and as they had been before the cord broke. He promised nothing out loud. He only breathed and let the promise settle where it would hold. The night came on clean and cold, and he lay back and watched the stars return one by one. He had lost a home and a wife and a name in a single night, but he had not lost the land, and the land had not lost him. Somewhere ahead, men believed the story was finished. He closed his eyes and listened to the creak and began the long work of remembering who he was. The humiliation came back to him in pieces as he moved closer to the places where men talked too freely. It was not the fire that burned the deepest, it was the laughter and the way it lingered. He reached a small settlement by late afternoon where a feed store leaned into the wind and a saloon sat across the street like it owned the ground. He stayed outside and listened. Men spoke his name as if it were a tool they had borrowed and broken. They said he had been taught a lesson. They said the woman had chosen poorly and was being corrected. They said the town would sleep better now. He did not step inside. He stood by the hitching rail and felt the words land on him like dust. He remembered faces from the night of the fire, men who had taken his beef on credit, men who had nodded at him from porches, men who had watched without lifting a hand. One voice said the law had looked the other way because it was easier. Another said the sheriff had been drinking and did not want trouble with families that voted. The story traveled fast and grew sharp edges. He followed it north to a camp by the canyon where riders tied their horses and deals were made with handshakes and glances. There, he learned how they had dragged her from the house. While calling it order, he learned how they had made him kneel and how a boot had pressed his shoulder into the dirt. While someone said look at him, he learned how a boy had been told to watch and remember what happens when a man forgets his place. He did not seek the boy, and the boy did not seek him because some lessons are not meant to be shared. He stayed in the shadows and watched the men come and go. He learned names and habits, and who led when voices rose. He learned which hands reached for weapons and which reached for approval. He learned that his wife was being kept moving from place to place, so no one could point to a door. He learned that she was alive, and that was enough to steady his breath for another hour. When hunger pressed, he traded work for a meal and kept his head down. He listened when men mocked him for leaving and laughed as if he agreed. He let the insult pass because it gave him something more valuable than pride. It gave him time. He followed a trail at dusk where the land dropped and the air cooled, and he found tracks he recognized. Her step was light and careful and always favored the left. After long days, he knelt and placed his palm to the ground and felt the shape of it. He rose and moved on. At a creek crossing, he heard a song carried low, the kind meant to be heard by only one person. He did not answer. He waited until it faded and then moved the other way. He knew the song and knew what it meant. It meant patience. It meant survival. The men believed the worst was over because no gun had answered their fire. They believed shame would finish what the flames had started. They believed he would drift and drink and disappear. He let them believe it. He let their confidence grow because confidence makes men careless. He slept near juniper again and dreamed of the beads lined on stone, and they dreamed the cord was mended and the beads were warm and heavy. He woke before dawn and held the beads in his hand until the feeling passed. He washed his face and stood and looked toward the canyon where voices gathered. He had been humbled in front of his land, and his marriage and his name had been spoken as a joke. He did not carry rage the way men expect. He carried memory, and memory is heavier. He stepped onto the trail with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided what will not be taken from him again. He returned to the place where the house had stood when the moon was thin and the air carried the smell of rain. He had walked a long loop to be sure no one followed, and the land accepted his steps as if it remembered him. The posts were black and the hearthstones were split, and the ground still held a shape. Where walls had been, he knelt and brushed ash aside with the back of his hand until his fingers found the hard edge of a stone. He knew he sat there for a long time without moving, because stillness is a kind of work, and it asks for patience. He took the beads from his pocket and set them on the stone the way he had in his mind again and again. He did not rush. He placed each bead as if it were a word that needed to be said only once. He remembered the day she tied the cord herself and said it would keep her close to home, even when she traveled. He remembered how she laughed when the knot slipped and how she retied it tighter. He pressed his thumb to the leather and felt. Where it had snapped, he did not curse the men who had broken it. He let the quiet do what quiet does best. He listened to the creak and the wind in the cottonwoods and the small animals that had returned because fire had passed and left. He took a breath and then another and spoke low to the ground because the ground had heard worse and kept secrets longer. He said he would not trade blood for blood because blood only feeds itself. He said he would not forget the faces or the voices or the way the laughter had sounded. He said he would bring her home, or he would bring the truth back to the men who thought truth could be burned. He said he would walk until the land showed him where to stand. He said he would carry the beads until the cord was mended or until his hands were empty again. He said he would not hide, and he would not beg, and he would not hurry. The words felt heavier when he spoke them and lighter. When he stopped, he stayed until the moon moved and the shadows shifted and the cold settled in his bones. He gathered the beads and tied them with a strip cut from his shirt, not as it had been, but enough to hold. He stood and placed the cord around his neck and felt the weight settle where it belonged. He took one last look at the ground and then turned away, not because it hurt less, but because looking back would make him small. He walked north this time toward a ridge where paths crossed and men with memory gathered. He moved with care and slept little and watched more. He avoided firelight and chose starlight because stars do not lie. He followed water when he could and stone when he could not. He listened to the land for signs, and the land answered in small ways. A broken twig, a bird that went quiet, a track that turned where no track should. He learned that waiting is not doing nothing, it is choosing the right moment to step. He reached the ridge before dawn and saw smoke from many camps and heard voices layered like wine through grass. He did not enter. He sat where he could see without being seen and waited for daylight to make men careless. He touched the beads once more and felt the knot hold. He did not smile. He did not pray. He only set his feet and prepared to be remembered. He did not return to the ridge the next morning, and he did not return the morning after that. Those who had noticed a quiet man watching from the trees began to speak of him in the past tense. They said he had drifted south. They said he had taken work and lost himself. They said grief had done what fire could not. He let the stories breathe because stories are useful when they walk ahead of you. He moved east where the land opened and the trails widened and men traveled farther to talk. He worked when asked and left before names were traded. He carried water and lifted loads and fixed things that broke, because broken things always gather people. He listened more than he spoke and learned who held influence and who followed. He learned which elders remembered older agreements and which men pretended they did not. He learned where councils met and where firelight was forbidden and where silence meant respect. He learned that the land still kept records even when paper burned. He did not ask for help, and he did not offer reasons. He waited until he was asked why he carried beads on a leather cord that looked mended and worn. He said only that they belonged where they rested and left it at that. The men who noticed were men who had lost something once and had not been allowed to speak of it. Those men nodded and did not press. He crossed into country where the wind carried different songs, and he followed the rules that had kept him alive before he announced himself at the edge of camps and kept his hands open and his voice low. He spoke of a house burned and a woman taken, and he did not add anger to the telling. He named the place and the night and the men without adding insult. He asked where a man should stand if he wanted truth more than revenge. He was told to wait, and so he waited. He shared food and repaired a fence and helped a child lift a bucket without drawing eyes. He slept where he was told and rose before light and kept the fire clean. Days passed, and then more days passed, and the season shifted just enough to change the smell of the air. He felt the weight of being unseen become a kind of shield. When the elders spoke, they spoke in questions, and he answered with patience. He said he would not bring violence to their door, and he would not ask them to carry his anger. He said he would accept judgment if judgment was given. He said he would walk away if told to walk away. He said he would return what was taken if it was returned to him. He said nothing else. They told him to leave for a time and return when the moon changed. And so he left and returned when the moon changed. They tested him with waiting, because waiting reveals more than words. He returned thinner and steadier, and the beads were still there, and the knot still held. He did not ask again. He sat where he was placed and let the silence work. The elders spoke among themselves, and the sound was like wine through dry grass. When they turned back to him, they asked one question, and it was simple. Would you stand without a weapon and speak the same words before those who burned your home? He answered yes without pause because the answer had been ready long before the question. They told him to go, and to return at dawn on a day not yet named. He went, and did not look back. When he left the camp that night, the stories changed again. Men said he had vanished for good. Men said grief had finally claimed him. He did not correct them. He walked into the dark and let the land erase his tracks, because disappearance can be the first step toward being seen again. The day was named without being spoken, and he felt it before he heard it in the way birds lifted and settled again. He walked back toward the meeting place at a pace that did not rush and did not lag, and when he arrived the fires were already clean and the ground was swept. He stood where he was told and spoke the same words he had practiced in the dark. He said a house had been burned and a woman taken. He said he sought her return and the truth too. Stand where lies had been loud. He said he would not raise a weapon, and he would accept whatever answer followed. The elders listened and did not interrupt, and when he finished they did not answer at once. They sent runners not with urgency, but with purpose, and the land carried the message farther than feet could manage. By the next morning a handful of men arrived from nearby camps, men who had lost sisters and daughters to roads that forgot them, men who had watched laws bend toward comfort, men who remembered older lines on the land. They did not bring rifles, they brought blankets and water and a way of standing that said they would listen. When those men heard the story they nodded and said little and stayed. By the second day more arrived, some with horses, some on foot, some with scars that spoke before mouths. Did they ask the same questions and receive the same answers and stayed? The count did not matter, but it grew. 1 became 20 and 20 became many, and the many became a presence that changed the air. By the third day the camp moved closer to the open valley where paths met and voices carried without echo. Families sent word that food would be shared and fires would be kept low. Children were sent away before dusk, and that was understood without explanation. He stood among them, still unarmed, still quiet, still wearing the beads at his throat. The knot held. By the fourth day riders arrived from farther out, men who carried authority without decoration. They asked for names and dates and places, and he gave them. He did not ask for allegiance. He asked only that the truth be heard where the wrong had been done. The riders conferred and sent more runners. The land did the rest. By the fifth day the valley held a line of horses that stretched from cottonwood to stone, and men stood shoulder to shoulder without touching the number, surprised even those who had called them. But surprise was not the point. The point was that they had come without shouting and without threat. The point was that no gun had been lifted and no vow had been broken. Word traveled ahead of them, because valleys have ears and towns listen when the ground speaks. Men in the town counted the riders from a distance and miscounted because fear changes arithmetic. They said an army was coming, and they were not entirely wrong, but they were wrong about the reason. The line moved at first light, not fast and not slow, and the sound was not thunder. It was the sound of many hooves choosing the same direction. He rode at the front because that was where he had been placed, not because he had asked. The elders rode behind him, and the rest followed in a breadth that filled the road. 500 was the number whispered later, and it was close enough to truth to stand. He kept his hands visible and his eyes forward and his breath even. He did not think of the men who had laughed. He thought of the door that would open when the right words were spoken. He thought of the beads and the knot and the promise made to the ground. He thought of how justice moves best when it does not hurry. As the town came into view he felt the line steady and the valley grow quiet. The work of waiting had ended, and the work of standing had begun. They reached the edge of town as the sun climbed enough to show every window watching and every door pretending not to. The line slowed and then stopped without a word spoken because the men had learned to move together by listening. The street was wide and empty, and the hitching rails stood bare. The sheriff came out last and stood with his hands resting where a belt would remind him who he was supposed to be. He looked at the front rider and then past him, and his mouth dried because the count would not settle. The man at the front dismounted, and the sound of his boots on dirt traveled farther than a shout. He stood with his hands open and the beads visible at his throat, and waited. The elders stayed mounted behind him, and the rest held their places without shifting. The silence pressed the town until it began to speak for itself. A storekeeper cleared his throat. A woman pulled a child back from a window. A man laughed once and stopped when no one answered. The sheriff asked what they wanted, and the question sounded small in the open. The man answered with the same words he had carried across the land. He said a house had been burned and a woman taken. He said he stood unarmed and asked for her return and for the truth to be spoken where it had been buried. He said nothing about punishment. He said nothing about revenge. He let the words land and waited. The sheriff tried to answer with law and found none that would stand. A councilman stepped forward and spoke of order and was met with stillness. A rancher who had watched the fire from his fence shifted his feet and stared at the ground. A young man recognized the beads and turned away because recognition has weight. The elders dismounted and stood beside the man, and their presence changed the measure of the street. They did not threaten. They did not bargain. They simply stood as witnesses. The sheriff asked where the woman was, and the answer came from the crowd in pieces, and not from one mouth. A barn outside town, a room behind the store, a place not fit for a name. The man listened and nodded, and said he would wait. He did not move toward the place, and he did not point. He waited, and the waiting did the work. Men who had laughed now argued among themselves, because lies do not agree when the truth is present. The sheriff sent runners, and they came back slow, because feet are heavier when they carry shame. The crowd grew as people learned there would be no spectacle and no gunfire, only a reckoning. The elders asked for those who had carried torches to step forward, and a few did not, and were named anyway because memory does not need permission. The man did not look at them. He watched the door he had been told about and kept his breathing. Even when the door finally opened, the sound was like wood easing after rain. She stepped into the light and stood straight, though she was tired and the beads were not at her throat. She saw him and did not run, because running is not needed when standing is enough. He took one step and stopped because the elders had asked for order. She spoke first, and her voice carried across the street. She said she was here. She said she would speak. She said she would go home when the truth was done. The town listened because it had no choice, and because silence had taught it how. The man touched the beads and felt the knot hold, and understood that the hardest part had passed, and the next would ask for steadier hands. The elders asked for the truth to be spoken in order, and the order mattered because order is how wounds stop bleeding. The woman spoke first and told how the men came with fire and names, and how she was taken not as a prize but as a warning. She told how doors were closed and how a bed was offered like mercy and refused. She told how she was moved at night so the town would not have to see itself in daylight. She did not accuse beyond what she knew, and she did not raise her voice. She said she wanted to go home, and she wanted the land to remember what had been done. The elders nodded and asked the men to speak. Those who had carried torches were named and brought forward by neighbors who had slept through the fire and woken with smoke in their clothes. One by one the men spoke, and the truth came out uneven and thin at first, and then fuller as silence made lying difficult. They admitted to burning the house, and to taking the woman, and to believing they would be protected by habit and noise. The sheriff tried to interrupt, and the elders raised a hand, and the interruption stopped. The man who had stood at the front said nothing and did not look at the men. He looked at the woman and waited for her nod. When she nodded, he turned to the elders and said what he would ask. He asked that the woman be returned to him without condition. He asked that the land be returned where the house had stood, and that the men who burned it stand before the town and say what they had done. He asked that no gun be raised and no blow be struck, and that the law write what had happened, even if the writing came late. The elders agreed and said the rest would follow custom and memory. They said the men would rebuild what they burned under watch, and without praise they said the men would give labor where labor was owed, and would not leave until it was done. They said the town would witness and would remember, because forgetting is a choice. The sheriff swallowed and agreed, because agreement was the only door left. The men who had burned the house lowered their heads, and the sound of it was like dry leaves settling. The woman stepped to the man and took his hand, and the street breathed again. He took the beads from his neck and placed them in her palm, and she closed her fingers and tied the knot where it had broken. She did not look back at the men. She looked at the ground, as if measuring where to stand next. The elders signaled, and the line of riders eased back, without turning their backs, because turning away is also a choice. The town watched and learned there would be no spectacle, and no blood, and no song to carry the wrong away. There would be work and memory and days that answered each other. The man and the woman walked together to the edge of town and stopped where the road bent. They did not hurry because there was nothing left to outrun. Behind them the men began to speak the truth out loud, and the sound followed like weather in front of them. The land waited, and the creek kept time, and the work of justice moved from noise to ground where it could hold. They walked until the road softened into grass, and the town fell behind them like a held breath released. The elders turned their horses, and the line dispersed without sound because work remained in noise. Would not help it, the man and the woman reached the creek where the cottonwoods leaned and the light broke. Clean on the water, she washed her hands and face, and the dust came away, and what remained was steadiness. He stood watch, not because danger waited, but because standing watch felt like gratitude. They sat and shared bread given without ceremony, and listened to the day settle. The next weeks moved with the patience of rebuilding. The men who had burned the house came at first light and worked under the eye of neighbors. They hauled stone and cut timber and set posts straight. They did not sing, and no one clapped when the walls rose. They rose plain and true, and when the roof went on, it went on without blessing, because blessing comes later. The sheriff wrote the record with a careful hand, and the paper felt thin, but it held. The town learned to pass the place without comment, and children learned to ask quieter questions. The woman walked the land and chose where the door would face and where the hearth would sit. She tied the beads at her throat, and the knot held. She did not speak of what she had endured except when asked, and then she spoke simply and stopped. The man returned to work he knew and mended fences and brought water and learned again the sound of a morning that does not end in smoke. They did not celebrate, because celebration would have mistaken the lesson. They shared meals with those who had watched and those who had acted, and the sharing did more than words. The elders visited once and then did not return, because return would have changed the balance. They sent a message instead, carried by wind and memory, that said the work had been seen. Time passed, and the land accepted the house as if it had always been there. Grass returned where ash had been, and the creek kept its pace. The town did not become kind, but it learned restraint, and restraint saved lives. A year later, a traveler asked about the place and was told the story without names, because names give too much comfort. The traveler nodded and moved on, and the road kept the tale. The man and the woman planted trees and waited for them to take, and they did. He taught a neighbor how to set a hinge square, and the neighbor thanked him without looking away. She taught a child how to read the sky, and the child learned when trouble came from another direction. The town answered slower and with more thought, and that was enough. They stood together at dusk one evening and watched the light leave the field. He touched the beads and felt the knot, and she rested her hand in his, and neither spoke, because what mattered had already been said by work and by standing and by returning without blood. Out here, justice does not need a gun. It needs memory and witnesses, and the courage to wait until the right moment to speak. Then it needs silence so the land can carry it forward. Experience, a powerful tale of lost dignity and quiet justice, set in the American frontier, where a burned home and a stolen life lead not to bloodshed, but to moral reckoning. This dramatic narrative follows a rancher and his wife as they endure cruelty, silence, and exile before returning with truth, witnesses, and the strength of community. Crafted for fans of Western stories, this immersive audio journey explores honor, memory, and restraint in a land where justice moves slowly and speaks softly. Through vivid landscapes, patient storytelling, and deeply human choices, the story reflects the enduring values found in classic Western stories, while offering a modern perspective on compassion over violence. Listeners who appreciate thoughtful Western stories will be drawn into a world of dust, fire, and resolve, where courage is measured by restraint and victory is earned through dignity. Perfect for audiences who seek Western stories that focus on character, moral tension, and emotional depth. This unforgettable frontier drama reminds us that some of the greatest Western stories are not about guns or glory, but about standing firm when silence matters most.